Professor Allott, it's a great pleasure to interview you for the Eminent Scholars Archive. Your scholastic reputation is grounded on dual foundations, what we might call an early apprenticeship as a legal advisor in the civil service at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and later as a prominent academic here in Cambridge. During these interviews for the archive, could we talk initially about the highlights of your life and career, and then come later to a general discussion of your scholarly work? I'm sure there'll be many listeners very eager to hear more of your radical visions for the future of international law and its role in shaping human society. So could we start with your early life, your childhood, your school days? You were born in 1937 in Sheffield.
Yes, well, I think probably there were three determining early facts in my life. The first is that I was born into a very large family. I was the youngest of 9 children. The second is that up till the age of 8, from the years of 2 to 8, it was the Second World War, and that obviously must have had some effect. Thirdly, the family I was born into was Catholic, Roman Catholic, and people have often asked me, has this had an effect on the whole of your work? And in due course I will offer an answer to that. So just going back to the family size, as I say, I was the youngest of 9 children, and although I don't take much notice of the birth order theory, it probably is true that to be last in a large family must have some particular effect on one. In my case, of course, it's mixed up with the war, so it's very difficult to say which was cause and which was effect. But it was a very tiresome family in that, to me as the youngest, they all seemed to be formidable people. They seemed to know everything. And this certainly caused initially a sort of competitive spirit. There was a competitive spirit around. It was a very bookish household. And we all read a very great deal and talked. And I remember for some reason we all seemed to read the Encyclopaedia Britannica as if it was light literature. We had a marvellous Victorian edition of it. And so I developed interest, for example, in astronomy, which many boys do. And I remember telling the master of this college, Martin Rees, Astronomer Royal, that at the age of 8 I intended to be the Astronomer Royal. And he had achieved it and I hadn't, which seemed to me to be unfair. I also became interested in numerology through reading these odd books, and I decided that I would die in the year 2001. So 2001 was quite an interesting year. And then I thought perhaps I got the numerals in the wrong order and I might die in year 2010. Well, I became ill in the year 2010, but I seem to have survived that year. So it was sort of that sort of household, really, which I suppose maybe was much more representative of those days. Now it would be very, very unusual, but in those days it was sort of normal, and sort of normal that everybody would talk about everything in a sort of vaguely competitive way. So that had a big effect, but in another sense, obviously the war had an effect, but not in the way one would expect. In other words, the war was not a sort of searing experience of deprivation and fear at all. Perhaps partly because one didn't know anything else. But the usual things were there. I mean, with rationing and so on, there was a sense that it was a bit of a help, actually, because you couldn't spend much money during the war. I remember things about the war. In Sheffield we were bombed. Obviously it's a great steel city, was the leading steel city in Britain. and my father was managing director of a subsidiary of biggest steel company, Thomas Firth and John Brown. And oddly enough, the German bombers didn't seem to bomb directly the steel factories, because the assumption then was that they were going to invade and they would need the steel factories, so they seemed to bomb the centre of town. And in our road, at the bottom of the road, a firebomb fell but didn't ignite. I remember that the house next to ours was requisitioned by the army, and all I can remember is that they practiced digging trenches in the garden, which I think might have been suitable for the First World War, but I'm not sure had much to do with the Second World War. And we had to sleep in the cellars of the house during the bombing, which was exciting. And we had to build an emergency exit from the cellars in case the whole house collapsed on top of us. But as a child, that seemed to be more exciting than anything else. And we had a German prisoner of war camp 3 or 4 miles away in the former isolation hospital, where the chief doctor was at prep school with me, our day prep school, and then became a Lord Justice of Appeal, Paul Kennedy. But I remember going to this concentration camp for a prisoner of war camp and looking through the gratings, what do you call it, the fence, wire fence. And of course they were living a rather nice life because they were in a hospital. And I do seem to remember meeting a German prisoner of war. I think they were allowed out to visit families. So it was really quite a nice regime for them. I remember on holiday at the seaside meeting free French sailors. That would be either at Filey or Scarborough, I suppose, and who seemed nice, jolly people, but one didn't really feel that it was part of anything real at all. I remember also a day when the whole sky was full of bombers going eastwards. It's a sort of famous scene where the whole sky is full of bombers, hundreds of them. I don't know where they come from, but they were going east. Perhaps that was at the seaside. And I remember a V-2 rocket going over the house, watching it from an attic window. That was the silent one that just went absolutely straight line. It must have missed Antwerp or something. And heaven knows where it eventually landed, in the countryside somewhere. But there again, that was just an interesting thing for a child to see. It didn't strike me as very terrible at all. And during the war, my eldest brother was in the King's African Rifles, lieutenant in the King's African Rifles, and he, just at the very end of the war, he was going to go out to Burma when the atomic bombs dropped in Japan, so that probably saved his life, the end of the Japanese war. And my eldest sister worked in a radio factory making radar components. And my second eldest sister was in the women's army. I don't quite know what she was doing, driving lorries presumably. And those were 2 convent girls, so it was quite an experience to them. And then my next brother and next sister were away at school in the south near Oxford. So there was a lot of coming and going in that sense. We were required to billet an officer. Everybody was required to have somebody. We didn't really have much room. And all I remember about that is that he put his shoes outside the door to be cleaned, which annoyed my mother rather considerably. We never cleaned his shoes, I don't think. So it was that sort of war, really, very odd, because you'd have thought it would have been a sort of foundational fact. The horror of war would have led me into all this idealist reconstruction of international law stuff, but I can't honestly say that it did. I did dream about German soldiers climbing the drain pipes into my bedroom, that I do remember. But I can't honestly say that it was a searing experience. At the end of the war, certainly 2 things had an effect. One was the first pictures from Belsen concentration camp, which the British liberated, of sort of emaciated skeleton bodies. That etched itself on my mind, absolutely. And secondly, I remember the front page of the Daily Telegraph when the atomic bombs dropped, explaining nuclear fission and showing a cup full of uranium which would be able to drive a ship across the Atlantic, we were told. And that was the first time we'd ever heard of it. Oh my goodness.
Should
We leave it. And so that then did begin to impinge the end of the war, when one began to learn. I remember the newsreels, cinema newsreels of the Nuremberg trial very clearly. And it was all in black and white, which made it seem even worse, obviously, than in Nuremberg. And I hope I'm right in saying that I thought the Nuremberg trial was wrong even then. I'll later mention why I definitely formed the view that it was a ghastly.
How extraordinary, because you would have been a boy of 8.
Yes,
at
no,
that time.
that I certainly remember. Because the newsreels were full of it, obviously, in the cinema. There was no television. So maybe those did etch themselves in one's mind as very remarkable and horrible things. So then, being a Catholic, obviously and notoriously has an effect on one if one is a Catholic as a child and one has remained a Catholic the whole of one's life. But for the moment I'll just say that I think the main effect is that you have a different sort of vision of the world, what I nowadays would call transcendental. That's to say that you always know that there is something beyond the everyday, sort of vertically beyond it. And that certainly alters your mind fundamentally, and I don't think even lapsed Catholics ever get rid of that. It's just knowledge that all the sort of nonsenses of the world and all the good and bad in the natural world, beyond it there's something. Doesn't matter too much what. But that means that one's mind is constructed slightly differently from other people, non-religious people. But obviously I'll come back to that later to see whether there is any real link. And then I should, I should really mention a fourth thing, which is that I was terribly lucky in that I went to extremely good schools. My parents were extremely saintly in that all 9 of us were privately educated, not in state schools. To this day, we have no idea how they afforded it. And we were very lucky, both in my prep school and my public school, in those days were of the highest possible quality. 4 of us were at the prep school, which was in walking distance from our house. And it was really very, very good. My brother and I, my next brother, took school certificate while we were still at prep school. School certificate was the predecessor of the O-levels. But in those days, school certificate, you had to get all 6 subjects or you wouldn't get a school certificate. And my brother got 5 of the 6 subjects. I got 4. With a distinction in French, I may say, when we were 12 or 13. We had a marvellous French teacher, Mrs. Postlethwaite. And there again, that's had a big effect because it meant that my father had had a degree in modern languages from Sheffield University and was very keen on languages. So the 4 last children all did modern languages. And that had a big effect on one's life, obviously, because modern languages, French and Spanish in my case, tend to widen one's horizons in a very big way. And then when I went to public school, that was a Downside school, which is a school, Benedictine school, connected with Downside Abbey in Somerset. And looking back, one realizes again I was incredibly lucky, marvellous teachers. And some of them had been in the war. There was a marvellous man who taught us Latin called Captain Stallibras, would you believe, who used to look out of the window as he taught distantly as though he was still at sea. And we learnt advanced mathematics from Colonel Page, who again looked as though he was not really terribly happy teaching after having been in the war. And we had a marvellous teacher of Spanish who had been at Jesus College, Oxford, a Welshman. And the amazing thing, looking back, I can't understand how we did it. We read vast amounts of classical French and Spanish literature, which children now not for a moment do. And that's a very precious possession. You know, one has read, I would now say, most of classical French and Spanish literature. I did advanced mathematics, which is the beginning of one of the might-have-beens of life, which I enjoyed enormously. Calculus and coordinate geometry and mechanics and so on. So I might have gone on to do mathematics here at Trinity College, Trinity College being a famous place for mathematics. But I didn't. I chose to do modern languages here, French and Spanish. And so about just completing on the school side of it, the school was also rather odd. It had a very strange history in that, being a Catholic school, it was in Belgium from 1605 until about 1860 or something, when the disabilities against Catholics were removed in 1829, the Catholic Emancipation Act. And of course, teaching Catholicism was a criminal offence in this country till the 1780s. So the school had been, English people had gone to Belgium. So this came back to England and settled in Somerset. And it was odd in that a lot of the sort of Catholic European aristocracy were there. It was known as the Catholic Eton at the time, this school. And again, at the time, one just didn't realise there were people called Prince Trubetskoy and Prince Sapieha and Count Tiskevich and such, and various Catholic British aristocrats, the sons of the Earl of Perth, and vaguely people from the Norfolk, Duke of Norfolk's family and so on. And there was a Martini, and there was the nephew of General Franco. But boys being as they are, totally equal at school, it never sort of crossed one's mind how exotic. Had I thought about it, I would have, made sure that I got to know the Prince Trubetskoy rather well, since his ancestors are mentioned in War and Peace. But at the time, they're just wretched boys, other boys. But that again probably had an effect, because it felt very international, the school. Because these people came from everywhere. And only later did one realise, I don't know, that they owned most of Gibraltar or whatever. You only realise later. So then, I was the school librarian, if I may say so, he says proudly, and I reorganised the library according to the Dewey Decimal System. Again, I don't know how I found time.
This was in your secondary school, when you were at secondary school?
Yes. How did one find time to reorganise the library according to the Dewey Decimal System? On top of reading Russian literature and American literature and all these other things. I cannot fathom it. So then four of my brothers went to Oxford and two came to Cambridge. And I'm only at Cambridge because my nearest brother went to Oxford. I always thought I should have gone to Oxford, really, which is a sort of more worldly place, but Cambridge has the advantage that it's a more serious place, I think. And Trinity College I chose in the usual ludicrously fortuitous way, that I asked my brother, who'd been at Trinity Hall, what was the best college in Cambridge. And he said, well, I should say Trinity Hall, shouldn't I? But I think I'd better say Trinity. And that's the only reason I came to Trinity College. I'm infinitely grateful to him for that altruism. So then when I arrived here, and of course the nature of people here in those days was, again, very different vast majority, obviously, were from public schools, for whom it was just a continuation of the same way of life, really. But there were large numbers of very, very clever people from grammar schools, and that was a huge achievement of the system. A lot of the very best people were, some of the public school people just came here for parties and to go to London and so on. But others, I was in a very serious group of people, mostly old Etonians, I may say, who were extremely serious, and we didn't pay any attention to those who played games and went to parties in London, really. So that was a very good atmosphere as well, of sort of charming seriousness, which typified the place at the time. And so I read French and Spanish for the first year, and my supervisor in French was a man called Ralph Lee, who later in life edited Rousseau's letters in 50 volumes and became very famous. But at my time, I always say it's one of the reasons I gave up modern languages for law, was I remember discussing with him in a supervision the merits of a play by Marivaux, French 18th century dramatist. And he thought it was a marvellous play, and I thought it was a dreadful play. And it suddenly struck me this was not a very sensible way of spending one's time, and also wouldn't get one a job.
I wondered what drew you to law.
Well, it's difficult to say. I can't really know. My two eldest brothers read law at the university, but I think that had no effect whatsoever. The man I shared rooms with, I'd been at school with, Robert Walker, who's now a law lord, member of the Supreme Court, Lord Walker of Gestingthorpe. His father was a barrister, and probably that had an effect. I shared rooms with him in our second year. But I can't really remember. I don't remember that it was purely career-orientated. I suspect it may have been the intellectual challenge, that it really did seem like something where you had to have something more than opinions about 18th century plays. But I've never really remembered why that was so. Very difficult to say. I remember that again, we were very lucky in that there were excellent people teaching law at the time. Imagine having H.W.R. Wade as a supervisor.
He was your supervisor? In
land law. He hadn't yet become the great administrative lawyer that he became. Tony Jolovitz, great master of tort law. Elliot Artepact, great master of international law. And they were one's supervisors, so one saw them the whole time.
Professor Allott, were you ever taught by Sir Herschel-Lauterbach?
No, I don't think I ever saw him or heard him. Nor really McNair, who was at Keys, wasn't he? He was on the court, presumably at the time, McNair. And Harry Holland was still here, but obviously was in retirement. I also remember sitting beside him at the fellowship admission dinner, which we have here for new fellows of the college. And he was a famous university administrator, above all, Harry Holland. And I remember him turning to me and saying, more or less, "So why are you here? What is your background?" And I said, "I used to be a legal advisor in the Foreign Office until last week." And he said, "Interesting appointment," which, being an academic, is a very complex statement, which includes, why on earth are you here if you've been a practicing lawyer? interesting appointment, he said. And then we had Mickey Dias for supervising in jurisprudence, who was a remarkable man who taught a very clear view of jurisprudence, i.e. not belonging to any particular, prejudicial school. And that's reflected in the book he published on jurisprudence. And that, I think, had a big effect because he made it all seem clear and sensible. Since then, everything has gone mad in that field. And now there are thousands and tens of thousands of books, and it's a complete mess. But and it was very similar in international law, because, of course, in those days there were very few books. Nobody can believe it. There were very few books and very few articles. That had the effect, I think, of throwing the whole thing onto oneself and one's supervisor and lecturer more. Because now students spend their time going through books and articles and so on, which doesn't encourage original thought, I don't think. But then there was practically nothing. Just very, very few books. And so the lecturers mattered more. And of course, famously, I can't remember whether it was true at the time, but Professor Jennings and Professor Parry used to lecture at the same time in international law. And that is a very cruel thing to happen, because Professor Jennings' lectures, of course, were completely clear. He had one of the clearest minds on the face of the planet. And Parry was an enormously sort of thoughtful, intellectual sort of man. So his approach to international law was completely different. And you can imagine the result was that vast crowds went to Professor Jennings' lectures, and a handful of very serious people went to Professor Parry's, which I don't think that happens nowadays, the direct contrast. I'll mention Professor Lipstein later, because he was very important to me when I came back to Cambridge. And I suppose I have to mention already Elie Lagerpacht, who's had an absolutely determinative effect on my life, obviously. In the second year, when he was my supervisor in international law, the main thing was, and I've told him this several times, that he made international law seem incredibly glamorous. He always wore beautiful suits and drove a very nice car. And during supervisions, he would just happen to be called on the telephone from Hong Kong or Buenos Aires or somewhere. And we, children as it were terribly impressed by this. And I really do think it may have had an effect on thinking international law must be an incredibly glamorous profession. Also in my second year, 1956, it was the Russian invasion of Hungary. And Elie Lagerpacht asked me to do an opinion as a second-year undergraduate on the Russian Soviet intervention in Hungary. And I always say that began my depreciation of international law, because it all turned on the question of something called intervention by invitation. Allegedly, the Hungarian Prime Minister had sent a backdated letter to the Soviet government saying, "Would you please intervene?" And I then so I put this all down in this opinion, and I then formed the view that international law must be completely ridiculous if the legality of an intervention by the Soviet army could depend on a ridiculous piece of paper. And I mean that seriously, that it did strike me that there was something very peculiar about this system of law. And then, I must mention also the rather remarkable supervisor I had in contract I'll obviously come back to Allott back later, who was Gordon Slynn, who was a weekend supervisor coming down from London practicing barrister. And of course Gordon Slynn went on to be a Advocate General in the European Court and a Law Lord, I think, in this country. But to my dying day I shall remember the first supervision with Gordon Slynn in contract, because we discussed a public weighing machine and what is the contractual structure of a public weighing machine. And we learned that it is a sort of standing offer to do something, and when you put a penny in it, you are concluding a contract with somebody on terms that it will accurately tell you your weight on a little piece of card. And that completely changed my view of the world, because I suddenly realized that everything, every event and every object has its second significance, which is legal significance, that really only lawyers know. But stepping onto a zebra crossing, dozens of bits of law suddenly apply to you. And literally at that moment of that supervision, there was a complete change of one's mind, that this was another world of meaning and significance, complete world of meaning and significance, and coherent and in some sense rational. I think we then went on a sort of mad riff to consider a weighing machine that speaks your weight. And if it said you were 18 stone and other people could hear, would that be slander? Because there's no limit to how you can analyze potentially legal situations. And of course he was a very good supervisor, a very remarkable lawyer, Gordon Slynn.
I think Professor Jolowitz was also a weekender.
Yes, I did it myself when I was a pupil at the bar, and in those days we seemed to rely on that a lot. I don't know if they do so much now. But that had the slight advantage that you were dealing with people who were out in the world. It was very important to have pure academics, but also these were people who the rest of the week were arguing in court or something. And that is quite useful. And of course we had this famous man for criminal law, Henry Barnes, who only my generation knows of. But he had a very peculiar career. He'd been president of Mexico for a day, for reasons I now can't remember. And he had a very dramatic and, you might say, scurrilous view of criminal law. And the girls from Girton and Newnham had to sit at the back because he used to recount in infinite detail all these unpleasant crimes against the person. And I then formed the view, which has remained with me for the whole of my life, that the criminal law is a scandal. Dreadful, dreadful. And I once took part in a debate arguing the proposition that criminal law is a crime. And I've applied this more recently to international criminal law, which I'm utterly against, because criminal law is terribly unfair socially and terribly primitive and barbaric in its nature. And I think Henry Barnes may have instilled or caused this absolute hatred, because in exams you had to answer more or less the question, as Henry Barnes put it, what do you get him for? You'd be given a set of facts, and our job was to answer the question, what do you get him for? And that didn't seem to be a sort of adequate way of dealing with life's problems. But so these were influential people, and Bill Wade, of course, was an enormously impressive person. As I say, then he was the great master. He'd written of land law. He'd written a very famous book with McGarry. And he'd only just started his interest in administrative law, a famous article he wrote in 1955 called The Basis of Legal Sovereignty. But he was a very wonderfully clear and cool and authoritative man whom I greatly respected. And obviously when he became famous for administrative law, the real maker of administrative law, I came to admire him even more. Jack Hampson I hardly knew, although he was in this college and had been at the same school as me. I hardly knew. He must have retired, perhaps. But he was a enormously respected figure, as was Patrick Duff, who again, I didn't study Roman law here, and hardly knew him, I must say. Michael Pritchard's lectures in legal history I went to, and he again was a master of that subject, wonderfully clear. So looking back on these people, again, to be quite honest, one realizes one was rather privileged. These were very fine people. I'm not meaning to imply that I'm making a judgment on all subsequent people, but it just so happens that we were extremely fortunate in these people. So that, I think, was the essence of the Cambridge experience, which in many ways is very different from the world as it is now. It was much more gentlemanly world, to be quite honest. Now all this business of handouts and photocopies and all that sort of thing were totally unthinkable. I don't think there were any syllabuses in those days. Well, in fact, I'm sure there were no syllabuses. You know, the lecturers or supervisors just more or less did what they wanted to do, and it was a completely different feeling of the enterprise. And now it's enormously professionalized and enormously bureaucratized, which in one way obviously is infinitely better. They're getting better value for money in that sense, the students. But this was part of a different world where law was almost part of general education in a way. It wasn't merely a preparation for practice. And supervisions were real discussions. They weren't preparing exam answers as they tend to be now. They were just you sitting in a room with somebody who was a very great expert in the subject, talking to them. And if you had a bright idea, they were very pleased. I remember once with the supervision with Lesley Dingle, we were talking about the problem of damages internationally. I'm sorry to recount a story in my favour, but we were talking about damages, quantified damages. And I said, I don't know where I got it from, damages might not be quantified, but the question must be, are they quantifiable? And Ellie absolutely seized on this. Knowing him, it was probably part of some problem he was involved with, and thought that was a terrifically good distinction between quantified and quantifiable damages. But that's the sort of discussion we had, and nobody ever mentioned an exam question at all. Incredible.
I had a lecturer like that for Roman law too. And of course, many of my fellow students hated him.
Oh, right.
But he was not prepared to, really, spell it out step by step. He gave you some ideas, and you were expected to go and read.
Exactly. And I gave up supervising because we had a wonderful rule in this college that you could give up after 20 years. I gave up because it had completely changed. They'd started arriving with notebooks, more or less either asking something that wasn't clear in a lecture, which I suppose is reasonable, or could we do an exam question? And I'm afraid that wasn't what I felt I was very good at. And before that, people now can't believe that they might be given sherry during the course of the supervision. And it was a sort of discussion.
Oh, lovely.
It's an amazing change. I'm not necessarily saying it's worse or better now, but it was a totally different world.
I believe there's a certain tendency now to lecture very slowly so that every word can be taken down.
Exactly. Well, now in lectures, again, it started, I don't know when. You know, if you said, could somebody open the window, they would note it down nowadays. Incredible. In my day, there were people who sat at the back reading the newspaper. They didn't feel the lecture was of much interest. Totally different. But as I say, I was of a group of people who thought it was all terribly serious. I mean, we worked very hard. But also we went on reading and talking enormously. And I cannot again work out how on earth we found the time to do all that we did. It's just, I can't understand it. But we all went on reading and talking about art and everything else. And in those days I started travelling, particularly to, I went to Greece and Italy. And again, the students nowadays travel to North Borneo and heaven knows where, but in those days you just did Europe, really. And I'm terribly grateful that I did then, because particularly France, Italy and Spain, and then when I lived in Germany for 3 years, you know, it's a terribly important part of culture, and had a big effect on one's attitude to the European integration problem, that one was terribly fond of these countries. But that started then. And then I stayed for a 4th year to do what was called the LLB then, it's now called the LLM. And I didn't do it very successfully. I had marvellous colleagues, including Rosalind Higgins and Andrew Jacovides and Owada was here around that time, and Steve Schwabel was here for some reason. And as Rosalind Higgins says, it was the most extraordinary group of people we were. Again, at the time, we didn't know that we would all go on with international law and take it quite seriously. But I didn't do very well in it because at the same time, my parents then were rather short of money. So I did both parts of the bar exams during that year. Because in those days the bar exams were obviously completely different from now. So I had to do 1 or 2 subjects for the bar exam, part 1 that I wasn't exempted from. I remember I had to do Roman law, which meant pacing up and down in my room, learning by heart a nutshell on Roman law. And I had to do company law and equity and other such things, just sort of learning them by heart over that year. And also during that year, I took the diplomatic service entrance process to go into the ordinary part of the diplomatic service. And that in those days was an enormous performance, taking a long time. And in the end, I remember there was a terribly grand final selection board in some very smart building in Mayfair. And I came 5th on the list, and they only took 4 that year into the diplomatic service. That's one of the great might have beens of my life. Had I come 4th on the list, I would have become an ordinary diplomat, which would have been a completely different life. But then in those days it was enormously selective, and they only took 4 people. So that was that. So I then went to do my pupillage at the bar.
About 1960?
Yes, 1960 it must have been. 59 to 60. And I was a pupil of a man called Robert McCrindle. I think I was in early Lighterback's chambers, must have been, I suppose, which was 2 Essex Court, the best commercial chambers, and which was later divided up by order of the Bar Council because it was too powerful. It had absolutely everybody in it. And Bob McCrindle was a wonderful person, my pupil master, because he was terribly unconventional. I think he was the first person ever to wear a blue shirt in court. He had to wear a white collar with it, because I think he read the instructions which said that you had to wear a white collared shirt. But he was very against the establishment, and was a junior, because only juniors have pupils. And he then, shortly after, left the bar altogether, to enormous surprise, because he was obviously going to be a judge, and went to, I think, Sullivan and Cromwell in Paris as a solicitor. I mean, as a, well, solicitor in that sense, in Paris. But he was an inspiring person because he had a terribly practical, I think he was in the RAF during the war, he had a very practical view. And I remember a case where our client was the chap who invented those lifts at the back of vans, which you see. Fantastically useful thing, but it was a patent infringement. We met the man who invented those. And he would take any case that he felt like, Bob McCrindle. So we dealt with a case of somebody being hit by a cricket ball at a village cricket match. And then most of the time we'd be dealing with vast cases involving shipping and bills of lading and all that sort of thing. And I shouldn't mention the thing I've never said publicly before, that I was so poor at the time that I couldn't afford the pupillage fee. At that time, pupils were not paid. You had to pay. And to become a pupil, you had to pay 90 guineas or something. And the head of the chambers, whose name I shall not mention, paid it for me. And he said, as long as you never tell anyone that I did it. But without that, I couldn't have done it. There were days, because I had no money at all, there were days when I didn't have a meal. I had a currant bun at the ABC in Fleet Street, because I only had weekend supervising at Cambridge. And that was how people lived in those days. Now I believe they get salaries as pupils. I can't imagine what that must be like. So that was a very hard time. So when the job of assistant legal advisor in the Foreign Office became available, I think it was obviously a desirable thing to try and do. Although I have to say the initial salary when I was appointed was £900 a year, which shows the difference, yes, the decline in the value of money.
It must have been a crucial point in your career, because so much of your work is predicated on the linkage of the state and society and law. So it's sort of this route that shaped, yes, everything else that followed. And I mean, do I get the sense, Professor Allott, that this was actually a career choice for you?
I think it was. Because I hadn't got into the general diplomatic service, I suppose it seemed a reasonable thing to do. And in those days, there were practically no jobs for international lawyers at all. Now there are lots of different opportunities around the world, but there were really no jobs. International law was hardly ever mentioned in the courts, obviously. So I think it must have been... I'd like to say that it was a sense that at that point I already wanted to change the world, but I can't remember that that was the case. And I have to say, in those days, the Foreign Office was an extremely glamorous institution, and had a very, very high standing in Whitehall. In Whitehall, the Foreign Office and the Treasury, as soon as I started going to meetings, you discovered that people sort of kept quiet while the Foreign Office and the Treasury were speaking. It was a very glamorous institution. And when the legal advisors of the Foreign Office were, and I think still are, organized in the most wonderful way. by far the best form of organisation among foreign offices in the world. I went to a conference in Wisconsin about foreign office legal advisors, and it was quite obvious that ours is the best system. That it's not a department, the legal advisors in the Foreign Office. They are separate people who happen, obviously, to work together. And what you do is you advise, say, 2 or 3 of the departments of the Foreign Office. So you're assigned those departments, and you're on your own. I was 23 when I joined the Foreign Office. Again, in many foreign countries, you'd be 33 or 35 or something. I was 23. And I remember my beginners' departments were Consular Department, Protocol Department, and for the moment I've forgotten the third. Consular Department was what all the consuls all around the world were doing. So it was hundreds of different problems, but not of great political significance. Protocol Department was dealing with the foreign diplomatic services, essentially. That was a very interesting way of learning about diplomatic immunity and learning about orders and decorations. I remember being told straight away that the Queen is terrifically learned in orders and decorations. And by and large, foreigners are not entitled to wear their orders and decorations in the presence of the Queen, except with certain exceptions which she knows. So we got sort of mad questions about could they wear. I wish I could remember the third department that I advised. But that was a marvellous beginning, terribly intelligently done. And as I say, you were by yourself, and you only consulted anybody more senior if you couldn't think of if you felt a bit worried about the advice you were giving. And there was another marvellous system before the days of computers, in that everything was done in writing, of course, on minute paper. And there were marvellous books that the legal advisors had kept, in which were stuck copies of earlier opinions by people. So if you got a problem, you could go and look what Gerald Fitzmaurice had said about it, or somebody had said about it. And that was marvellous, because even the ordinary diplomats used to regard us as the sort of memory of the Foreign Office, because we sat there dealing with all these different problems. They were dealing with special areas. So the legal advisors were a sort of collective memory of the Foreign Office. And because you changed your departments you advised, from time to time, eventually you did get to know rather a lot about all the different things the Foreign Office did. Oh, I should just mention one other thing about when I was appointed, when I first arrived. Sir Gerald Fitzmaurice was the legal advisor. And so I had to go and see him, as it were, when I arrived. And he was in this vast room overlooking St. James's Park. And he was an extremely shy man, very, very quiet man, very grand in his manner. Always used to wear a pearl stud in his tie and that sort of thing. And obviously for him it was a ludicrous embarrassment how to talk to somebody. You can't possibly tell them the working hours or how you make the coffee or something. So it was a very embarrassing interview. The only thing I remember was that he said, on Friday afternoons, you can probably go off if you want to go shooting for the weekend or something. Because that again was a different world. We started work at 10 o'clock, I remember, by which time all the subordinate staff had come in, and we had coal fires in our rooms, so that messengers had lit the coal fires, and somebody had got all the telegrams together. And then the secretaries arrived at whatever it was, 9:15, and we breezed in at 10 o'clock. And I think really left at certainly sort of 5:30, and you had 2 hours for lunch. And since most people went to diplomatic cocktail parties in the evening, you were not expected to work in the evening. So again, however, we managed to do everything in these very short hours. But again, it was such a gentlemanly world. And I always say that senior people in the Foreign Office in those days had empty desks. Nowadays, if you go into a senior person in the Foreign Office, they have piles of files. And in those days, these people used to just sit there very grandly and sort of decide things. Totally different feeling. And then zip off to lunch at their club, and then in the evening go off to a diplomatic cocktail party or a dinner. And that's how sort of the British Empire was run, I think, because this was the end of the time of empire. I don't know how, again, that has changed. Now they're all fantastically busy. And all the gentlemanly aspects presumably disappeared. But so that was a marvellous way to start. And then I got on to more interesting departments, economic relations department and nuclear energy and disarmament, I remember, and the UN department.
Professor Allott, you mention in your preface to your book, Eunomia, that you were at the UN in 1963 for a General Assembly session. Was this sort of a singular experience?
Well, it was very odd that, because the resident legal advisor, we always had a resident legal advisor in New York, and that in those days was Joyce Gutteridge, and she became ill and went into hospital. So I was sent out. I remember I arrived there on the day President Kennedy was assassinated. And on the British Airways plane, the pilot came round and told each of us individually, presumably thought it wasn't the sort of thing you say over the public address system. So as soon as I got to New York, I had to buy a black tie. This was my first official act in New York. But so that was the session of the General Assembly in, is that 63? Yes,
that was 63.
So I was never the resident legal advisor in New York, but I went to various sessions as the secondary visiting legal advisor to help the resident one. There's always a second one who goes to New York. Or there was, I don't know what they do now. So I spent a lot of time in the UN, and I shall mention it later, I think, because, I formed very strong views about the UN. But it was the beginning of something that I enjoyed most of all and miss most of all, which is multilateral diplomacy, which is the most wonderful activity. I don't think it improves the world one iota, but as a professional activity, working with people from many different countries on particular problems. And it was true in my time in the EU as well. It is a wonderful form of activity, which I miss very greatly. But I'll come back to that when we deal with the EU, because that was very much the case there. So the UN in those days, of course, was a tiny number of states, and we were still, had the hangover of empire or Commonwealth with us. So people did listen to us in those days. And we were very influential, obviously, in those days still. So that it was, and it was dominated, obviously, by the struggle for independence for these countries. I can't remember which time it occurred. I'll mention it now, although it might have been a little bit later. On the Colonial Territories Committee, we faced endless people going on about how shocking we were as colonial oppressors in all these countries. I remember one occasion when we were examining the constitution of a newly independent country, Commonwealth country, And the Russian delegate said, in the usual way Russians did, sort of holding the thing up to make fun of it, he said, "I'm afraid I can't understand this constitution. I believe it's meant to be democratic, but it appears that the Governor-General appoints the Prime Minister, can veto legislation, can sack the Prime Minister, appoints the judges. And I thought this was a democracy." And of course we replied that there are things called constitutional conventions, and he won't actually do any of these things. But I, for some reason, always remember that as a moment, because it was a very fair point that he'd made. It looks ridiculous. And of course, an Australian Governor-General did eventually sack a Prime Minister many, many years later. But it made one realise what a very peculiar thing the British Constitution is, where everything's done apparently by the Queen. In fact, she doesn't do any of it. So we discussed things like that endlessly. And when we were in the sort of accused box, but the Sixth Committee dealt with, I went to, mostly we sat in the Sixth Committee, the Legal Committee, obviously, and things that were less political, less controversial.
I think you alluded to matters economic because you had a hand at this point in the UNCTAD negotiations.
That's right, yes. At that time there was a great pressure in the 60s for making the world economically fairer through legal means, by drafting endless things, which again, I think honestly I did know at the time were ridiculous and would not change anything. And all it did was to lead to endless debates and endless sort of oppositions, dialectics between the developing countries and the developed. And the developing countries were generally at that time relatively inefficient in arguing. They got much better, obviously, later on. And so there were these two things. There was also the West-East dialectic. Everything was made nonsense by that. And so those two things together, the East-West and the North-South dialectics, determined everything. And you never sat and thought, would this paragraph actually make somebody less poor somewhere, or give them something to eat somewhere? Never really thought of that. You thought, shall we put the word normally in Article 66 or something, so that it weakens the obligation? And I believe I remember an afternoon when I went through the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States and changed every shall to will. Shall being obligatory and will being not obligatory, in the hope that nobody would, since we're the masters of the English language, nobody would notice. I'd love to check to this day whether the word will is used in the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States. And I went with Henry Darwin to defining aggression, which again, I knew at the time was ludicrous, because we wanted to get classed as aggression, anything that Soviets might do, and they wanted to get classed as aggression, anything that we might do. So we had these endless discussions about words, which we had complex instructions from London that this will scupper the position in some remote territory somewhere if we allow the word is in article such and such. And I went to the committee drafting the Declaration on Friendly Relations. Ludicrous, because that grew out of the Soviet obsession with what they called peaceful coexistence, which was their new version of international law. And the Americans obviously couldn't accept the expression peaceful coexistence, so we found at the beginning of the UN Charter the two words friendly relations. Ludicrous. And so we had this declaration on friendly relations between states. Again, totally cynical from start to finish. And now it amuses me so much that not only students quote all those documents, but practicing lawyers and even courts, even the International Court. And when this new definition of aggression was adopted recently, it preserves by reference that old one which was made a resolution of the General Assembly. And so I'm very glad that I'm not teaching anymore, because I would have to tell the students that all these things are completely ridiculous, and people only refer to them because they're there. They have no merit whatsoever. So you can see that I began to get a bit, as it were, dubious about the whole situation. And then, of course, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. And the odd thing about that is that we knew very little. In the Foreign Office, they have this marvellous, in those days, marvellous system of telegrams. And each morning, all the telegrams of the office are circulated, at least they are to the legal advisors. So you see what's happening absolutely everywhere. But very oddly enough, we knew next to nothing about this in the Foreign Office in London. Perhaps the senior legal advisor was advising on quarantines at sea and so on. But perhaps I wasn't no, I must have been in London. I just don't remember. And of course that was one of the most important events of the 1960s, when we were an inch and a half away from nuclear war. I think I was advising Atomic Energy and Disarmament Department then, so I can't quite understand why I didn't know about it. But presumably it was dealt with on a very secret level and a very high level. Yes, I just didn't know. So I had this on-off relationship with the UN for all these years, and then and the other thing was, again I'm getting uncertain about dates, but I was the London end of our delegation to various conferences, particularly drafting the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Immunity, or Diplomatic Relations, whatever it's called, and the UN Convention on the Law of Treaties. And the way the system works is that delegations very often, well, I'm not sure always, have the delegation out in the field doing the negotiating. And then in London there's a sort of dumbbell team who have to do the instructions, coordinating with other Whitehall departments. And so I was doing that. Ian Sinclair was doing the actual negotiation very, very brilliantly. And I think because I was advising, I probably stopped advising Protocol Department. I was much involved in the diplomatic privileges thing, and then the passing of the legislation, the Diplomatic Privileges Act 1964, or whenever it was, when we put it into English law. And that was very reasonable and honest. And of course the treaties one was of the highest interest, because that's a very fundamental treaty. And that I don't think involved much coordination in Whitehall, because so I think the Foreign Office more or less invented its own instructions for that, the treaties, Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. And because Ian Sinclair was so experienced and so good, I'm not sure that he needed many instructions. But as you know, it became very dramatic at the end as to fights, particularly over the interpretation articles, which people at the time thought were enormously important debates. Because the Americans had sort of espoused the views of Miles McDougall in the Yale School on interpretation. And we were against that. We would take a terribly British view of plain meaning rather than purposive meaning for treaties. And so there was a huge compromise which the students now have to study in the convention between strict meaning and purposive meaning. And there again, enormous effort had to be taken over the wording. And my recollection is that it was agreed on the sort of the last day. And at the last minute, or if not after the last minute of the conference, it was the last remaining big issue. And seemed important at the time, and has given grist for the mills of many academics. But was probably an intelligent compromise and probably worked out by Ian Sinclair, I would guess, in recollection. And then I went to New York for 6 weeks to do it seemed like 6 weeks, I can't remember exactly how long, to do the Convention on Special Missions, Special Diplomatic Missions, with somebody from the Protocol Department. And I have a feeling that has not entered into force. I haven't followed it. No, I can't remember what happened to that. Now, the other thing I was going to mention, and why I say that I can't understand how we did all this, is that I was involved in lots of conferences. I went to the conference on a convention on damage for nuclear liability. I went to a conference on nuclear ships. I went to a conference on creating patents for plants, which is about the most useful thing I've ever done, probably, speaking as a gardener, with delightful delegations, including horticulturalists. We had on our delegation a famous Sam Macready, the man who's invented lots of species of roses. And the French had Monsieur Villemorin, who is the great French horticultural chap. So that was delightful. And we invented a whole system, plant varieties system, which is fully operative to this day. So I think that was probably the most useful thing I ever did in the real world. There were all these endless conferences, and once Geoffrey Marston, a colleague from Sydney Sussex College, who used to look at the public records a lot, and he said to me once, I've been reading the Foreign Office archives, and it always said, to Mr. Allott to advise, and then Mr. Allott is away. He said, were you ever in the office? I did seem to spend an enormous amount of time away. But sometime I made a list, but I've now lost it, of all these things we drafted. It's amazing. Must have been a dozen, I should think. And which meant also I spent a vast amount of my time in hotels, it seems, with delegations. I just tell one tiny story against myself, which is, I remember it may have been at Plant Varieties. We got instructions from the Foreign Office saying something or other, and it had a draft of a diplomatic note, and it began HMPSFA. This draft note. And so we were in a delegation meeting, and they said to me, what on earth does that mean? And I had to admit I hadn't the slightest idea what it meant. And it apparently meant Her Majesty's Principal Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs presents his compliments. You know how you remember embarrassing things? I felt so embarrassed that I didn't even know what it meant. I never forgot it. So writing instructions and receiving instructions is a huge part of what the Foreign Office does, and it's a wonderful art. We were very good at it. We and the Americans always used to arrive at conferences with great books of instructions, including what's to happen to the comma in article such and such. Other people, particularly the French, would arrive with nothing. I always used to say that the French foreign policy has always been the same for centuries. So if they were faced with a problem over a comma, they didn't need instructions. But we and the Americans always had voluminous instructions written in London, literally books.
And in between, you in 1963 were assistant agent for the UK in the Northern Cameroons case.
Oh, that's right.
In
That's
the
the only
ICJ.
time I was involved in the International Court.
It's only 26 years old at the time.
Yes. And that was a great experience, not necessarily from a improving the world experience, but, from a sort of bureaucratic professional experience. It was very interesting. The Attorney General then was a man called Manningham Buller, who was a very fierce gent. And I do remember that once he was shooting in Scotland on a shooting weekend or something, so we all had to go to Scotland to discuss the case with him, and he in his tweeds and his bad temper waiting for us. But it was shortly after the South West Africa cases, which were huge, huge case arising out of aspects of colonialism. And ours was a littler case about the Northern Cameroons. And I remember early on learning that when we left the Cameroons, we left 97% illiteracy, which didn't seem to me to be... Actually, there might be something to be said for illiteracy, but it wasn't thought to be a very good achievement by us. And Maurice Bathurst was our main counsel, a man of very strong opinions. And so we sat round developing these arguments, and I will say this in my favour, that my argument was argument number 9. I didn't present it, this was just drafting the speeches, which eventually won the case, namely that the whole thing was OTOs, and there was no point in it's all water under the bridge, and there was no point in the court giving the judgment. So I went into English law about OTOs judgments. But it was a very humble, mechanical thing, because of course in those days photocopiers didn't exist. So I remember in our hotel room in The Hague, there was what in those days was called a Gestetner machine, where you put the thing onto a sort of skin, and then when paper was placed on top of it, it appeared on the paper, and you turned the great handle of a press. So I was doing that, producing the Attorney General's speech, and the next day we went into International Court, and the most dreaded thing possible happened. The Attorney General was in full flight, turned over a page, and the page was blank. We'd missed a page out. Again, you remember those things. Isn't it extraordinary? You remember those things that you don't remember that all the enormous work we did on it. And but that was very useful to see the International Court at work. And we did, in that sense, win the case. But again, you can imagine the political implications of winning that case when we were not very good colonialists.
And apropos that, and from a reading of your preface to Eunomia, I sense that you might have felt somehow slightly embarrassed at having to represent an imperial power whose actions you were beginning to disapprove of, or maybe these feelings only gelled in retrospect.
No, I think at the time I knew it was a silly game, to be quite honest. And I've always been against the International Court. I wrote an article about it. And Sir Robert Jennings very kindly, it was called the International Court of Justice and the Voice of Justice or something. And for Robbie Jennings' Festschrift, I think. And he very kindly said it was an absolutely marvellous article, but since I couldn't quite understand that, because the main theme of it was that the International Court is not a very good idea. got nothing whatsoever to do with justice. But he may have been referring to the prose style, I think, rather than the content. But it did seem to me terrible. I remember him saying, Sir Robert Jennings saying to me, when I did criticise it, that at least we prevent wars, he said, about the International Court, which I left hanging in the air, but I mean, I can't accept that for a moment, because there shouldn't be wars. And you don't dispense justice, you just dispense law. But no, I think I did at that time realise this was very peculiar. And the Cameroonians, our Cameroonians, as opposed to the French Cameroonians, were extremely nice, jolly people. They came along to the court because they had to. They were deeply involved in it. And all I remember was a lunch with all the delegations in which I explained to a French Cameroonian in French the laws of cricket. And so that was something useful done. Quite difficult to explain in English, let alone in French. But they were, the French, there was a marvellous contrast between the French who were extremely serious and the English Cameroonians were extremely jolly and nice. And I don't think cared tuppence what came out of the case. Quite rightly, because I'm not sure it made much difference to anybody in the end. But yes, so that was useful. Just before then, and that was just before I was posted to Berlin, which must have been in '65. So shall I talk a bit about Berlin?
I was going to ask you whether you feel you'd like to continue, Professor Allott. I mean, we actually still have, it's a very interesting time.
Might be a good time to break, do you think?
I think that might be good.
Because the Berlin thing obviously is quite complicated.
Very, and very interesting as well. So I can just thank you at this point very much for a fascinating interview, and to say I'm looking forward very much to continuing next week, 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 continuing next week.